Amtrak is a company with a very rich history, but how do you go about sharing that history with the public? Today on the Roundhouse, we are talking to the lead brand communications specialist at Amtrak. All aboard!
In days past, the roundhouse was where the railroad worker united with the steam locomotive, each to prepare for the journey ahead. Today, it's where we examine the history, the industry, the machines, the hobby, and the passion behind railroading. News, interviews, stories, and more. So climb aboard. This is The Roundhouse.
Welcome to The Roundhouse. I'm your host, Nick Kozarek, and this is episode number 46 of our Trains and Railroading podcast, where we talk about everything in the industry and the hobby, you name it, and we discuss it. Today, we are talking about Amtrak, its history, how it commemorates that history, and how it communicates the importance of passenger rail travel. We are talking to Matt Donnelly. He is the lead brand communications specialist at Amtrak, about what it took to get the heritage units created and some of the other ways they celebrated their 40th anniversary, what his job entails, what he likes about working at Amtrak. Before we get to that, though, I've got a very special announcement to make for you guys. Here at the Roundhouse, we're coming up on 50 episodes. And that's a really important milestone, I feel, because that is such an amazing collection of stories that we've assembled thus far from all of our wonderful guests, and we're just going to keep going. I wanted to have a way of thanking you guys and learning more about you that felt properly big. That's why we are doing the 2016 Roundhouse Northeast Corridor giveaway. It's very simple. All you have to do is complete a short survey about listening to the Roundhouse, your thoughts on how we're doing, what you'd like to see in the future, and you could win 2 tickets for Luxury Rail Travel's Philadelphia to New York City trip aboard the Alexander Hamilton passenger car, which is a Pennsylvania Railroad observation car. That trip is going to take place October 30th on a Pennsylvania Railroad observation car. We will be picking 2 lucky winners. Each will be receiving 2 complimentary tickets for this trip. It's a once-in-a-lifetime experience to be able to ride a former Pennsy car on its home rails. And all you have to do is complete a very short survey. We don't ask you for much, and we're not going to give away any of your information. We just ask you for your name, your email, and a phone number so that I can give you a call to let you know if you've won. All you got to do is go to theroundhousepodcast.com/survey. All the rules are there. All the details are there. It should take you about 5 minutes, and I really appreciate the time you take in filling out the survey. I keep saying the Roundhouse is our house, and this is one of the ways that I'm going to ensure that I'm giving you the content that you're looking for. Of course, this giveaway is made possible by Luxury Rail Travel, and if you want to guarantee that you'll have a seat on that trip, go to luxrailtravel.com and you can book tickets and use the coupon code ROUNDHOUSE to save money off of those tickets. And if you should happen to win the giveaway, they will refund up to 2 tickets completely. So if you love riding on classic passenger cars and you want a fun way to spend your October, look no further than the Roundhouse Northeast Corridor giveaway. Again, go to theroundhousepodcast.com/survey for all of the details you need. Our guest today has a very important position with the national passenger rail system that is Amtrak. He is the lead brand communications specialist. Please welcome to the Roundhouse, Mr. Matt Donnelly.
Thank you very much, Nick. That's a wonderful introduction, and I appreciate you having me on the show.
Glad to have you on the show. Amtrak is such an interesting topic of conversation amongst rail fans. It's an important part of our nation's travel infrastructure. So there's so much to discuss. I'm glad that we finally have a good opportunity to discuss it in full. what led you to working with Amtrak?
That's a great question. I've always had an interest in aviation as well as railroads, and I suppose it was always in the back of my mind. What are you going to do when you're going through school, when you grow up, so to speak? What are you going to do to make a living? And it just kind of worked out that going towards the railroad was more of a path that worked out for me. And in college, I pursued different avenues to try and help my chances, and I ended up landing an internship with Amtrak. And after I had graduated from college, I just pursued a full-time career with Amtrak, and it took me a little while, but I eventually got my foot in the door and worked my way on up through the company.
You mentioned this idea of difference in operations from the different positions you've held with Amtrak as you've built up your career, and comparing that with freight operations. What are the non-obvious differences?
Well, honestly, I really can't speak too well to the freight side since I haven't worked there. But just speaking as a matter of dealing with people instead of inanimate objects like just freight, general merchandise, or whatever commodity you're talking about. That's what interests me. I enjoy the human element and interaction and providing a service to people and bringing that service in an optimal level, so you can have people at the end of their trip say, this was a great experience, I want to come back and do it again, versus packages or goods or whatever. I mean, it's very transactional, point A to point B, drop off the freight, that's it, you're done. That's what I enjoy about passenger operations versus I think freight, even though it's still railroading and it interests me, it just doesn't have the same level of excitement.
That makes perfect sense. How did you end up building your career through Amtrak to your current position now?
I actually hired as what was called a commissary clerk. I hired out of Albany, New York, and on my first day, I was told probably not going to stay in that position long. It was a union position, so it's based off of seniority, and there was somebody that was likely going to what's called bump me out of my position. But the good news was that since I was the low man on the totem pole, so to speak, they would not bump me out of the company, so I'd be unemployed. There were other vacancies that I could fill, one of them being a ticket and baggage agent. So I graciously accepted that position, and 6 days later, I went on to be a ticket and baggage agent up in Syracuse, New York, and I worked that position for about a year, and I had a really great boss who's now retired. But he informed me of what was called a management associate position, and that was designed basically to give people a once-over and a good view of different areas of the company, provide a lot of different training to eventually work your way up to a management position. So I was very fortunate to be accepted into that program, and I ultimately ended up becoming a train master, which is railroad term for being a frontline supervisor of conductors and engineers. I was based out of Washington Terminal in Washington, D.C. After doing that for a few years, became a product development officer working as a part of the marketing department to make different services more efficient and or better the passenger experience, and did a couple other things here and there along the way. And now I'm back in the marketing department, but now over on the branding side of the house.
It's so good to hear that Amtrak gave you this opportunity to start from the bottom and to work your way up. I think often in this day and age, there's concerns, not just in the transportation industry either, but that management and supervisor positions are filled by people who have no understanding or respect for the work that they're managing or supervising. And maybe in some places that's the case, but especially where so much with Amtrak is about the customer experience and providing service that the people remember in positive ways. It's good to hear that type of structure exists.
Yeah, well, it's good. I'm laughing because when you mentioned that, I bet there's a lot of train and engine crews that I supervised that thought just that, because I was essentially came from a ticketing craft, not an operating craft, and now here I am being their supervisor. So I definitely had a lot to learn and to get my head around to manage an operation like that, not having done that. But to speak to what you said, I was afforded the same exact training and qualifications that any crew would go through. And even beyond that position, after I went to other areas of the company, it was really good to see all the different pieces and parts and how they work together. Because Amtrak, even though it's a good-sized company, it's not the biggest company that's out there, but since it is nationwide, there's a lot of different departments. There's a lot of different divisions. Positions on the board of directors are handpicked by the President of the United States. I mean, there's a lot of different moving parts, whether it's government affairs, all the way on down to over to the IT department. And other areas that make it work, that are behind the scenes that a passenger or rail fan doesn't normally have exposure to. So it's cool to be able to, work with a lot of those departments when I was in that management training position.
And now you are a very important part of overseeing how Amtrak is represented as a brand. For thinking about this idea of branding, where it's not always obvious in terms of what that means for a company like Amtrak, what type of work are you overseeing with that? What does it mean to manage Amtrak as a brand?
I think a lot of people, when you hear brand, they think of the logos or, the designs and the colors, but a brand really goes far beyond that. It's everything that you associate with that company. So it's a lot of different aspects. And quite honestly, in my current role, a lot of what I do on a day-to-day basis revolves around the more traditional aspects as far as logo approvals for whether it's going into a new station that's being built, to outside entities such as model train companies or other licensees that want to use the Amtrak name or brand on different products, but as well as such things as guides and documents and what the tone of voice should be. Because, of course, everyone has their own personal style of writing, but Amtrak as a company has a particular image that it wants to portray. So how do we consistently and uniformly, whether you're in the marketing department or government affairs or communications or wherever, if you're doing publicly available, outward-facing documents, how do you write to have a consistent tone of voice? So I work with a team of folks that come up with guidelines and style guides on how to do this type of stuff, as well as outside entities that want to use our brand.
One of those outside entities, just to use as an example, because we've had them on the show, is Rapido Trains. They're a model railroad manufacturer. We talked to Jason Schron, who is the founder of Rapido Trains, and their product line includes some examples of Amtrak's past, such as the F40PH diesel locomotives and the turbo train. For a product like that, when a model railroad manufacturer of any kind approaches you and says, we want to make your P42 locomotive, what are the types of steps that are involved in terms of gaining that type of approval, and what are you looking for as far as keeping that message consistent?
Sure. So really, it's very easy. As long as if they're already a licensee, which just about every model train manufacturer out there is, they've already got a license agreement in place, which has a lot of just legal terms and agreement things that speak to and making sure there's various levels of quality that are upheld in the product, because Amtrak wouldn't want to be associated with something that's subpar as far as workmanship, or making sure it doesn't involve child labor as part of the process, because we try to be very responsible about how our name is associated with different products, and making sure that whether it's environmentally friendly or whatever the case may be, those types of requirements are what go into the agreements. But when it comes down to a particular locomotive model or paint scheme, they'll broach it to me and I'll say, sure, no problem. Or if there's an issue we have to look into to make sure if there's other licensing aspects that are required that go beyond just Amtrak, we get other entities involved, the owners of that intellectual property, so we can hopefully all come together to make it happen. I'll do all I can to provide any documentation or photos, or sometimes it's something that's so old or goes back quite a ways that there isn't very much in the archives. And if an example exists that's still on the property, we can arrange to get those crews out there to actually photograph it or measure it, whatever the case may be, so they can produce as accurate of a model that they need to get out there into the marketplace. Because if the model sells well, then great, Amtrak gets its brand out there.
It might just be me, but I feel like in the past, I'm going to say maybe 7 years. It's a loose time frame, but I feel like it's been relatively recent history in Amtrak's history that you've, as a company, have really figured out how to appeal to people for travel. And I say that because I remember the early 2000s, there was an ad campaign that Amtrak was putting on where it was mainly about making fun of airline travel and everything associated with that, and take the train instead. But it felt like the train was a footnote, and it was sort of not the primary focus. And it seems like with the full utilization of social media and new ways of thinking, that Amtrak is starting to think more along the lines of, here is why you take the train. I'm curious as to what your perspective on that is, and what it takes in this day and age to get that type of message out there.
Well, I think, of course, with many areas, market is very fluid. Of course, different world events and national events happen, and it can affect people's travel habits. So goes the economy, so goes people's discretionary spending to take trips and to go places. And then aside from that, then there's your business travelers. So if things are doing well in the business world, there's usually a relationship between more people traveling for business than there wouldn't be. When things get tight, then you hear of a lot more of people having video conferences, and they forego face-to-face interaction. So there's a whole bunch of different factors that go into it, and part of marketing is adapting to the climate and figuring out the edge of how to get through to people, whether it's just for awareness, to bring Amtrak to the forefront of their mind, to make it a relevant choice and decision, to say, hey, I want to go somewhere, and gee, I haven't been on the train in a long time, or I've never been on the train before, and I've heard about it, always wondered about it. Maybe it's time I look into it a little further and hopefully take the plunge and go ahead and purchase a ticket and have a trip. And then the second part of that is to make them have such a good time that they become an advocate and they're a loyal customer where they want to come back. And then when they talk to other folks, it's so contagious about the story, how great of a time it was, that you hope that they now are producing further riders from telling their family and friends about it. So there's a lot of different angles to it, but of course there's many layers. And right now we're focusing on our new tagline is "See where the train can take you." Amtrak has over 500 destinations. When you take a look at all the different, not only the train stations, but we have a lot of thruway connecting services. So it's a one-stop shop to get your ticket to go to a lot of other places that aren't directly served by rail, but you can have that seamless transition to go from a train to a bus, or from a bus connection to a train. So there's a lot of different things that people may not be aware of that Amtrak offers, such as we allow small pets to travel with owners on many of our different routes now. It's a relatively new service. Not so new to the airline industry. They've been allowing carry-on pets for a while, but it's relatively new to Amtrak, and it's been doing really well. And it opens up a whole new market of customers that may not have even thought about Amtrak before because, I can't bring my pet, and then I'm not going. I'm going to drive, or I'm just not going to travel, or I'll fly, whatever the case may be. So there's a lot of different things in the works that are really exciting that I enjoy working on.
Finding the ways to highlight these little details as well, because sometimes it's just the fact of what you're naturally offering with the experience. The fact that if you're riding an Amtrak train, you're getting to see the scenery. And that's something where, yes, it's kind of basic, but boy, do you get to see it, especially if you look at some of the long distance train routes, but even some of the regionals offer really good scenic experiences. So sometimes to be able to put a social media post out that's just highlighting something little detail that you already have built in to the experience, it sticks with them for the right reasons and leads them to travel.
Yeah, and there's a lot of different really neat technologies out there with digital advertising where you can kind of geo-target different audiences, or depending upon what search terms or anything that they might be looking at, you could have a relevant ad pop up for a particular service that may be somewhat related to what they were looking at. So it's there's a lot of different unique ways to be able to get your product out there and build awareness for different services that we offer.
The biggest pat on the back that you possibly could ever offer the rail fans, and you did, of course, would be the heritage units. And heritage unit is a little bit of a misnomer because it's actually modern locomotives painted in previous Amtrak paint schemes. So it's not old railroads that became part of Amtrak. It's past brand identities of Amtrak that are being recognized. What was the evolution of that from your perspective, and how have you seen the benefits of the heritage units?
That all came out of the 40th anniversary planning and committee. I was a part of the core team of folks that sat down in a room. I think the initial planning began 2 years prior. The first just very high level talks about, man, this is coming up, and what would be really cool to do to nod to our history as well as celebrate 40 years as America's railroad, because it's a remarkable feat, especially given that if you look at the history of Amtrak and how it was created out of all these other railroads that wanted out of the passenger rail business. A lot of money was being thrown towards highways and towards airlines, and it was just not a very feasible business venture for many companies, and they were said, well, by the government, you can't stop, it's important. So this was the solution. So, well, if you either pay to get out, or you give equipment in lieu of pay, and then also allow this new entity called Amtrak to have access rights on your railroad, then you no longer have to bear, quote unquote, the burden of providing passenger rail service. So a lot of people thought that it would never last. It would only be around for a few years and then kind of take care of itself by just going belly up, and that was it. But now it's 45 years later, we're still going strong. It's a testament to the men and the women who have provided that service, whether it's from out in the back shops to fixing the seats to the people and the corporate levels that plan a lot of these different things to make, at the end of the day, the trains go up and down the railroad and bring people to and fro. So we said, yeah, we really ought to do something. This is a cool thing to be able to do. That was one of the ideas. Come up with, let's do some heritage paints. Of course, this was even before Norfolk Southern had released and announced that they were going to do their heritage schemes, and they did complete theirs a lot before us. And it was a good preview to see what the reaction would be among the community, especially the railfan community. And it was obviously a very popular thing. And we kind of figured it would, since there's some other airlines who have done throwback schemes. It was myself and a guy by the name of Blair Slaughter, who works in industrial engineering, who normally has a lot to do with paint designs and coming up with the diagrams to give to the shop employees to know, okay, this stripe's 8 inches, this one's 2.5, and this is where it goes, here's the colors and all that stuff. So it was really fun to work with him on all these things. Once we got approval through the various ranks, all the way up to Mr. Boardman, the CEO, he signed off on, doing a lot of this stuff. So I got to give credit where credit's due. We couldn't have just done this in a vacuum. It was probably the most fun project I've ever worked on, just because of, my personal interest in the railroad. It really had nothing to do with my job at the time. Everything I did on that was extra and above and beyond compared to my normal job duties to do. So, it was a lot of long nights working on, whether it was the book that we put together and or the paint schemes. But it was a labor of love. It was a lot of fun, and I enjoyed it. So we were able to throw together different iterations of what would a Phase 1 P-42 look like, what would a Phase 2 or a Phase 3, because those were the three schemes that had never been applied to that car body. Now, a lot of people are probably saying, oh, wait a minute, the P-40s, P-42s were delivered in Phase 3, which is true. However, it was a different variation of Phase 3 than what we were going for. We wanted the classic look, which was the equal 8-inch color band stripes to match what an F-40 would have looked like, since we were putting together also the exhibit train, which it still has an NPCU, which is an old F-40 that's been decommissioned and is basically just a cab control car with a P-40 that would be running around. So that was the guidance for that. I originally thought that the P-40 would be the as-delivered scheme, and I remember I got the phone call from Blair. I was on vacation, and he called me and said, and now they want it to look like the F-40. And I was like, well, that's awesome. I never even thought about that, but I think I'm going to like that even better. It's going to, it'll be consistent. So maybe that's the branding part of me coming out. I really like things to be consistent and to match, and I think that would look awesome on the train. So we threw together a few ideas, and I actually ended up painting some after models that I had undecorated, and tried a few different things out after we had played around on the computer just to see what it would look like, in 3D. From there, we made a few more tweaks, and Blair put the drawings together, and the 822 was the first locomotive of the bunch to be completed. I remember I got to go out to Beech Grove, Indiana, at the facility where these were all painted, and got to take a look, and we ended up, it was really cool, seeing, that was the first time when I was like, wow, this is for real. Like, all these, this couple of years worth of planning are finally coming to fruition. And we did make a few tweaks to a few of the sizes of the different decals. So the 145 is slightly different to make improvements. And of course, now that scheme is rolled out on a couple of the dual mode P-32s that run in Empire service. So it's obviously been very popular, not only among the fans, but among our state partner. And it was cool to be a part of all that, since it was like a dream come true to me to grow up with Phase 3 and these different paint schemes, and now to be involved in team, to be able to put these out there in present day to honor Amtrak's history of being around for 40 years. It was really cool.
And to think it started with painted Athearn models. You started with the model train before it went to the big one.
It did. A lot of people don't realize I did a Phase 1 and a Phase 2 for models. So actually, it was the reverse profits. And it was hilarious. When I went out to Beech Grove to take a look and meet all the guys that were doing this work, they actually had photos of the models I had painted taped up on the wall along with the paint diagrams. It was pretty funny to see something that I had worked on in my house, on my own time. And it ended up becoming Amtrak's main facility for painting this equipment. And here's the different people working on this, referencing a model that I created. It was pretty wild.
The exhibit train, which you briefly mentioned in there, that was such a great companion piece to those units as well. I remember first seeing it when it visited Harrisburg in 2011. It was such an interesting experience to go through the display cars, which were baggage cars that had been converted at Beech Grove, to see the evolution of Amtrak, its technology progressing over time, its interior decorating changing over time, even the horns. There's a section dedicated to the birth of the K5LA horn. And it's an interesting way of exploring that history, which certainly has a strong appeal to the rail fan and that detail-oriented side of us, but presented in a way that could have general public appeal.
Yeah, well, thank you. And for those listeners that aren't aware or haven't really seen much on it, there's a website that is history.amtrak.com, which is run by Amtrak, and it's kind of like our online archive of a lot of the material that came out of the 40th anniversary, because when we did the book, Amtrak's 40-year history, we had a lot of material that we were digging up and finding and scanning, and it really brought to the forefront the need for us to be able to have these things around for future generations. So everybody's always caught up in today and the project that's right in front of them without, always a lot of attention and forethought or budget to be able to say, hey, we ought to go the extra mile and create some of these as highest resolution as possible files and store them somewhere and have them accessible for the future. Please feel free to go check out that website, the exhibit train schedule is on there, as well as a lot of behind the scenes photos and a couple stories about how it was created, and then a lot of the stops that we did throughout that first year. The horn exhibit you mentioned, that was one of my pet projects. I also am very into music. Aside from my enjoyment of railroads and photography, I've gotten into different music instruments I play, and of course horns are kind of like that perfect combination, that cross-section of both of those hobbies. So I was able to design something that was interactive, where you push the button, you get to hear a recording of the different sounds, and a lot of people are familiar, like you said, with the K5LA, but not so much the other three predecessor models, I should say, that existed basically solely because somebody at Amtrak said, we want a unique sound for our brand, for our railroad. And they tried a few different things with the manufacturers, and here we are today with the K5LA that just about everybody uses. But that was really cool to be able to put those things together. And like you mentioned, not only just the rail fan focus, but for general audiences as well. We had on our core team of 40th anniversary members and planners, we had some folks that were rail fans, and we had other folks that were not, but they had an appreciation for Amtrak and the company and its history. So it's more than just showing one of each type of locomotive and each type of paint scheme and all that. It's more so about the services that have been provided, the destinations that have been served, and most importantly, I think the people that provided those services that work on the trains, not only on board in front of passengers, but as well as behind the scenes as well. So we really tried to tell that story both through the book, as well as when you walk through the exhibit train. It starts out chronologically from the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, and then a little bit of a glimpse into some of the things that have been planned for the future to give people an appreciation for where Amtrak has come from over these past 40 years. So this is a really cool project, and if anybody hasn't had the chance to check it out, sure, at least hopefully you'll go to the website and take a look. If not, get the opportunity to actually tour it in person.
History.amtrak.com. I'll have a link for you guys in the show notes for episode number 46 of the Roundhouse podcast, where you can visit that. A recent way in which Amtrak paid tribute to its history was with the farewell excursion to the AEM-7 electric locomotives. Now, these things have been in service since the 70s. They are getting on in years, and it's understandable that Amtrak has had the need to replace them with the new Sprinter locomotive. I thought it was a very interesting choice then to make sure that these machines didn't go quietly into the night, that there was an opportunity to showcase them for one last hurrah.
Yeah. Not to get too technical, but I believe the locomotives went into service, into revenue service in 1980. I believe they were built in the late 70s, but by the time they were done with all of their testing and FRA approvals and whatnot, it wasn't until 1980 that they began service. But like you said, they are the backbone of the Northeast Corridor, just like the F-40 was the backbone of the majority of the fleet outside of the Northeast. And to be able to be in a position to do something like we did with offering a farewell excursion that was combined with a tour of the Wilmington shop maintenance facility complex, where these locomotives were maintained throughout their careers at Amtrak, which is usually off limit to the general public, was really, really cool. And what spoke volumes was that the train sold out. So, I mean, you had, I think it was 476 or somewhere around that people that went on this train as a sellout, basically a Northeast regional consist. Folks who were there because they love this equipment, they love Amtrak, and they wanted to be there for the historic send-off, which was just, to me, is amazing. That's awesome. The support by the fans. If it weren't for the support, we wouldn't be able to do this. It was definitely an event to experience. If you hadn't, there's a video that we put up on the Amtrak YouTube account to kind of give an overview of what the day's events were like. And it was really cool to be able to, I got to be a car host for it. So I volunteered on my Saturday to be a part of it, because having been involved with these other events. A lot of other folks put in a lot of effort to planning this, and I didn't want to miss it. So I was more than happy to volunteer to be a part of that.
Of course, these equipment upgrades are happening. We talked about the Sprinter locomotives coming in, replacing the AEM 7s, and then also the CAF plant in Elmira, New York, is hard at work producing new passenger cars for use on Amtrak's long-distance trains, subsequently replacing a lot of the last remains of inherited passenger equipment, which has been rebuilt through the years, but is approaching the end of its working life. One AEM 7 locomotive was donated to the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania thus far as of recording this episode. Is the groundwork in place where if a museum or an organization comes to Amtrak with the interest of having one of these pieces of equipment preserved, is the groundwork in place to see through a donation or some kind of sale with reasonable terms? I'm just curious from a standpoint, and some of the listeners who are involved with museums and such who might have interest in preserving the equipment, what they might be able to do to pursue that.
It's kind of a roundabout answer, but I think the short version is yes, but there's a lot of caveats to it. There's a lot of things that depend on that. So like when you speak of the AEM 7s, some of those are leased. So if it's not owned by Amtrak, then, it goes back to the bank or whoever holds the lease, and we don't really have a final say over that. So even though it's painted Amtrak and it's operated as Amtrak, if it's not fully and wholly owned by Amtrak, then we can't go ahead and donate somebody else's property, obviously. But there is a mechanism in place for nonprofit organizations to be able to request equipment. Sometimes, unfortunately, it's not easy to be able to take on something as large as a rail car or locomotive. You got to have a facility that's safe and secure to store this type of stuff. You've got to be able to get it to wherever it's going. So there's a lot of pieces and parts involved with behind the scenes on how to be able to maintain and care for something like this too. So if there's places out there that are interested, they can definitely approach Amtrak and request with a plan as far as what they're looking for and what they plan to do with it. And it does get reviewed and it goes up the line, and it's if it's something that's possible that can be honored. Sure, like in the event of the 915, the AM 7 that already has gone to a museum. And that's wonderful because throughout the history of Amtrak, there's been a lot of locomotive types that haven't been preserved, like the P30CH. That was a unique to Amtrak locomotive. It played a part of history. I don't know if it's too many people's most favorite locomotive. It was not the most attractive design personally to me, but to me it's very important. It was the first new locomotive that came with HEP capability, and they were all cut up. They're gone. And once they're gone, they're gone. So preservation is definitely important. It's not something that's Amtrak's within its capabilities because we're a subsidized company that's meant to provide passenger service. We're not a subsidized museum. If it can be preserved, it's just that, unfortunately, not every single thing can be preserved. It's just not feasible.
Turning our attention back to the idea of travel and the idea of the 500 destinations, that is quite a number. I think I'm biased because I'm a Pennsylvanian, but I'd probably say that my favorite Amtrak trip to experience is Amtrak's Pennsylvanian, going from New York to Pittsburgh, going around Horseshoe Curve. It is a very scenic trip that I always enjoy, especially when the sun's setting around the curve. Hard to beat. Admittedly, I need to experience more of the West Coast. The Coast Starlight is on my short list. When you travel, what are your particular favorite pieces of the network to cover?
That's a tough question. I've had the fortune to be able to cover, I think, nearly every route. I'd have to go back through and think about that for a minute. I'm sure there's one or two out there that I'm missing, but I don't know if I could narrow it down to just one because there's so many different aspects that are really unique to different areas. But one that I really enjoy is the California Zephyr from Denver West was just phenomenal. The Starlight, like you mentioned, Coast Starlight, especially how on the southern end of it when you're going by Pacific Ocean is fantastic. And then once you get up to the northern end, when you're going through all the mountains with just pine trees everywhere, is amazing. But there's also some state-supported routes and corridors that are equally as amazing. You don't have to go quite as long, like the Pacific Surfliner down towards San Diego when it goes along the beach, which seems for just miles upon miles. It's phenomenal. Like literally, like somebody told me, like, oh yeah, it goes right next to the beach. I'm thinking, oh okay, it's literally right on the beach if you've never seen it before, which is crazy. And then the Empire Service from Albany down to New York goes right along the Hudson River for the majority of the route, and especially in the fall, it's just fantastic. But I could go on and on about the highlights of so many different routes, but if I had to pick just a handful, I'd leave it at those.
That's right. You got to go out there and experience it. Those of you who are joining us, I'm sure many of you have done some sort of Amtrak trip in your lifetime. And if you haven't, make a point, even if it's just a short day trip, a couple stations out and back. You owe it to yourself just to say that you got to experience part of the passenger rail network and to feel like you're part of something that's really big and moving in a way that's different from the interstate highway system, in a way that's different from the skies. It is a very unique type of experience.
For sure. And if you're a AAA member, if you book in advance, you get 10% off. If you're a student between the ages of 13 and 25, you can get 15% off. Of course, the further you book in advance, the better chance you have of getting a lower fare. So what I tell my friends that are interested in doing this type of stuff, I just say, hey, make it, think of it as like a bucket list item and just plan for, pick a year, whether it's next year or this year, whatever, save up. And then even if it's a time factor, a lot of people don't have the time to go all the way across country. They still have vacation for other holidays and family events. Consider flying one way or flying out to a particular point and taking the portion of the route. You don't have to do the whole thing end to end. And in fact, I think most of our passengers do just segments of long distance routes. Most of our passengers aren't going from endpoint to endpoint. So I couldn't agree with you more. It's just commit to it, pick a route, and save up for when you can finally do that and check it out, because it's a great way to see the country. And like I said, so many different unique aspects to the different routes, whether it's the Superliner equipment or the Pacific Parlor Car and the Coast Starlight to Viewliners and, like I said, currently Heritage Diners, soon to be hopefully Viewliner 2 diners on the East Coast. There's lots of different equipment, different scenery, and something for everybody.
And finally, at the end of the day, Matt, it's clear from talking with you how much you enjoy your job and how much you've invested in Amtrak, not just because it pays your bills, but because you do genuinely enjoy it and you get to be part of crafting its image and part of this larger system. What is it that you enjoy most? At the end of the day, you go home, had a hard day of work. What is it that makes you smile?
I'd have to say that whatever it might be, and it could be a variety of different things, it's knowing that I've made a positive difference, whether it's for a passenger or whether it's for a fellow employee or a group of employees, whatever the case may be, that's what keeps you going and lets you have a really good feeling that what you're doing made a difference and it's appreciated.
Matt, thank you so much for joining us here on the Roundhouse to talk about your perspective with Amtrak. Very interesting discussion, and I appreciate your time very much.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure, and I hope to see you guys out there on the train one day.
I look forward to that, too. If you ever decide to volunteer again as a car host, let me know.
Will do.
And now, the question of the day.
Last time on the Roundhouse, we were talking with Rudy Garbely and Richie King of Garbely Publishing, the new generation of print railroad publishers. And that brought up the question, what is your favorite railroad book? And I can think of so many interesting ones out there that I've read. Right now I'm in the middle of reading about the East Broad Top, and such a fascinating history that I'm sure we'll explore in a future episode here on the show. But here is what you guys had to say. This from Zach Librand. I've personally found the book that Johnny Myers wrote on the Texas Electric Railway the most interesting, but mostly because I live and work around Texas electric relics day in and day out. Plus, despite preferring to operate steam or diesel electric professionally, running traction equipment is my favorite thing to do for fun. I love the character that interurban railroads have, Zach, and I think that's something that's really interesting from a railroad history perspective and very unique to its time. This from Lawrence B. Miller. Tough one. George Hilton's 1963 book about the Maryland and Pennsylvania, the Ma and Pa, is a gem, and I say that as someone who grew up in the parts of Baltimore that the railroad ran through. But Beebe and Clegg's Mixed Train Daily has some of my favorite lines ever, including this, about a ride on one of the Rio Grande Southern's galloping geese. Quote, a down drag from Telluride had contrived to go on the ground, and 6 boxcars reposed in probable angles just below Vance Station in a farrago of twisted rails and macerated ties. The goose ran up a crew of cheerful and, it seemed to us, unwarranted confident track workers who expected to get the damage repaired before dark. We set out a great store of chains, jacks, and blocks and went on our way in the opinion that if they got the Telluride branch clear in a week, it would be a miracle of impressive proportions. Very impressive writing there, Lawrence. That sounds like a really interesting book. And lastly, from William Mankelow, the one railway book that sticks in my mind is Platform Souls, The Train Spotter as 20th Century Hero by Nicholas Whitaker. It's a great story of one man's love of everything train spotting in the UK. Check it out. Will do, William. Sounds like an interesting book. The title itself is very catchy. And I guess the author, the name's appealing. Your question of the day for this week is, how have you enjoyed traveling on Amtrak? Let me know on the roundhousepodcast.com. Links to social media there to keep the conversation going. Don't forget, guys, that survey, the roundhousepodcast.com/survey for the 2016 Roundhouse Northeast Corridor giveaway. Your chance to ride on a Pennsylvania Railroad observation car on the Northeast Corridor. The roundhousepodcast.com/survey is the place to go. Thank you guys for listening. As always, remember that the Roundhouse is our house.